as lower organisms move up the rungs of the ladder and vacate the lowest rungs, there's abiogenesis at the bottom. But there is a continuous line from whatever microorganisms there were to us as the pinnacle of biology. And that means that if there is an extinction, the whole chain of being has to start over. So that is one problem with Lamarck. Now I come on to the more modern ideas and Darwin does accept extinction. And extinction is important because once you accept it, then you also have to accept the idea of multiplication of species. Because if the species number were fixed by any means, extinction would mean that life would become extinct in the end. But what is the driving idea behind Darwin? Now, I could take a pause. I think I'll take a poll. Which of you think, put your hands up, that selection is the driving idea in Darwin? No hands? I can't see any. Yeah, I was just, that's a trick question because the other choice would have been competition. And this reveals something of a difference between quantitative studies and qualitative studies. If you count the number of times selection turns up in the origin of species, it occurs far more often than the word competition. But nonetheless, I think the word competition plays a more important role, and you can see this in Darwin's reaction to Wallace's paper. Wallace's paper was entitled On the Tendency of Varieties to Depart Indefinitely from the Original Type. And that tendency was competition. And so Darwin, in a particularly Darwinian way, doesn't mention the word competition, but he sells us to it very softly. And competition is an ultimate cause in Tinbergen's sense. That is, it will explain all of evolution. It won't explain the particular aspects of speciation, and that is what the modern synthesis does. Modern synthesis accepts Darwin's ideas of extinction and competition, and it gives us the proximate causes of how particular species originate. And to put that in a nutshell, it involves two ideas. One is genetic reorganization, and the other is isolating mechanisms. So now we've got those two sides lined up, the children's ideas and students' ideas, and on the one hand, and the scientific ideas on the other hand. And this suggests a number of possible teaching sequences. One possible teaching sequence would be historical. To start off with the classical ideas, move forward to Lamarck, and then on to Darwin, and then on to the modern synthesis. That would involve carrying a lot of extra baggage around that we don't really need in the end. Another one would be a deductive method, to say, well, extinctions happen, and that must mean that species multiply, that one species gives rise to more than one species. We could try prohibiting the morphological essentialism that children have and say, don't think that way. Well, that's like saying, don't think of an elephant. Yeah, who's thinking of an elephant? So I've come up with a different proposal, and the proposal involves the teaching of speciation over about a 4-year period, from about year 9 to about year 12. It involves practicing a couple of scientific ideas, and it starts off very close to the students' conceptions of essentialism, but it doesn't feed off them. If we view science as a continuation of common sense with other means, then let's start off with the common sense ideas that students might have and might be willing to accept from their naive morphological essentialism. The first step in this would be to create a matrix of a couple of species and consider which of these species would interbreed to give offspring. And we could start off with a very simple matrix of 3 animals, pigs, chickens, and goldfish. And, of course, pigs will only breed with pigs to produce piglets, and roosters and chooks to produce chickens, goldfish with goldfish to produce goldfish. If we continued that matrix on, it would become very boring because the only entries in that matrix would be along the diagonal. That is something that children are willing to accept. Now, that idea is very close to essentialism, but I haven't mentioned the word essentialism yet in this respect. But it's something they will accept, because I want to now introduce a scientific idea, and that is the idea of a gene pool. And this is where students' ideas about individuality can come in, that in a species we have individuals, they're all different. Some of them will breed, they'll pass on their genes to the next generation. It'll be like a bag of mixed lollies that's in there. The genes themselves will alter in frequency just a little bit from each generation to the next, but they won't alter radically. That is the idea of a gene pool. Now, if you started teaching speciation at this stage with the gene pool, you wouldn't get very far. I've seen textbooks talking about the peppered moth. It was once peppered, it's now black, it's now peppered again. There might be some speciation involved with that process, but it's not going to convince people who in their hearts are essentialists, but they are willing to accept the idea of a gene pool. Now, when you're going through this matrix and you're saying, well, look, only members of the same species can breed with one another, someone will put up their hand and say, what about the horses and donkeys? Oh, you say, well, we'll leave that to the next step. Once we've established the gene pool, now let's look at those animal hybrids. Now, do mules and hinnies represent a bridge between the gene pools of horses and donkeys? And of course, the answer is no, because they're generally sterile. Even if they're not sterile, they can't cause a large ingression into either of the gene pools, simply because the numbers don't add up. So that we get the idea that the gene pool is not only constant, but it's separated somehow from gene pools of other species. Now, once we're looking at this matrix of species into breeding, and we've got the animal hybrids, we come to a class of plant hybrids that are very interesting because the hybrids represent new species. Well, of course, you're going to meet with resistance once you bring up that idea. You don't normally get new species when you breed two distinct species. And so the question is, how do we decide these things in science? We do an experiment. And I think this is an experiment, if you had a school greenhouse, that you could do the experiment in with plants like brassica. I saw someone had brassica on their slide the other day, which is just cabbage, or with tragopogon, which is the example that I have. We would do an experiment and we would try to decide, is this new species really a new species? That's the first question we have to solve, and then there are other questions that turn up later.